Welcome to the COVID-19 impact on global supply chains with our facilitator, Dan Seawald. He's founder and CEO of Deliberate Innovation. He's a keynote speaker and author, a corporate innovation expert, and he also was head of worldwide innovation at Pfizer. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Gene. Good to be here.
So theme number one, understanding the scope and scale of the challenge. Give us some context about what this is about.
The topic is one of the most important ones. We hear about it in the news every day right now, that global supply chains are breaking down. So this was a great opportunity to explore how significant is the disruption, and then more importantly, what is happening? What are some of the themes? Is there things that we can do about it that we can glean from this eclectic network of supply chain experts? And that's just what we did.
Well, you put together a fantastic panel of experts. I'm curious, what were the panel's thoughts on the supply chain? Did they have any good insights that you can share?
There's probably more great insights than we even have time to be able to cover. But what I'm going to do is do a little bit of distillation of some of the things that were shared that were recurring themes and really seem to rise to the top in the conversation. And one of the first things, Gene, that really came up regularly was this idea about policy and regulation is affecting supply chain resiliency. And what do I mean by that? Is that there are decisions that are outside the controls, man-made decisions happening at the higher levels of local government, state government, that are having downstream impacts on their supply chains. But it's not just about the entities and organizations, it's also about the individual. And this term being predictably irrational, we know consumers have a tendency to do things that may not be in their best interest. Like, for example, stockpiling 50 cases of toilet paper. You're not sure where you're going to put them, how you're going to use them, but it puts a tremendous strain on supply chain because now you have to reload the supply chain, you have to be able to ship it, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I'll just hit on one more point here, which I think is particularly interesting. This half-life, this pandemic, may just be the tip of the spear. And what we sense is this is a shift to a new normal. And that expression is a bit cliche, but it is true here. There is a new normal in supply chain in the way companies and organizations are behaving. And if you work in supply chain, you have to react and react fast. And it's all highly interdependent. So these were some of the very high level things that came out, but there's a lot more, and we can talk about those bit by bit, piece by piece.
Let's get into key point number one then, because really there's a lot of financial strain on the supply chain, right?
Yeah, there really is. And there's issues happening with respect to cash flow, where your kind of lead supplier has cash flow issues. That puts strain on them to lean on their suppliers, and vice versa. If you see, pressure in terms of workforce, cash flow, lead times at your secondary suppliers, then you're going to see backup at your main supplier for a retail site. So cash flow, big challenge. And then this also affects long-term forecasts financially. Will they stay solvent? Can they stay in business? Can we rely on our networks? These are all questions that came up very frequently in the conversation.
What about things like commitments, contracts, force majeure? How is this affecting this whole baseball?
It's a great question because there was a conversation thread around force majeure. So force majeure come into play when a man-made decision to stop operating, comes into play, or do you have to wait for the actual disaster to have an effect? And that kind of comes into the discussions and negotiations between supply partners. And you can see that there's been cancellations of orders, and that has a downstream impact. Retailers are starting to rethink how they work with their different partners. And if you break a relationship now, it may be hard to rely on them later. So being able to have open, transparent conversations quickly with your partners is critical. You don't have them, it results in having damaged relationships. And really, it makes it difficult overall.
I was really curious about key point number 3 here, talking about all the pivots that are necessary. I mean, you talk about cliches that are overused. I mean, pivots, it's the name of the game now, right? So what are some things you guys uncovered and discussed?
Yeah, a couple of things are just worth hitting on here is this is out of necessity. Many of the manufacturers have to look for backup suppliers, but the backup suppliers may not be available. It's very difficult to identify them. So as this one comment was made by Amitabh, who's been a really good contributor in this, that European firms are moving from the ocean freight to much more expensive to make sure that they're getting product to where they need it. So absolutely, lots of different pivots in who they work with, how they work with them. The supply chain network, constituent parts are changing quickly.
Now, in key point number 4, you talk about the recalibration of management and trying to predict supply. How do you possibly do that when nothing is normal or predictable?
Well, it's hard to make predictions, especially in the future. When you build these sophisticated demand management or prediction models in the forecasting world, they often rely on stable assumptions. What happens when your assumptions completely get blown up? And that's what a lot of supply chain partners are finding in manufacturers. The things that they expected to hold stable under all circumstances are now shifting. So if you are the Gap, textiles retail manufacturer of clothing, they're seeing 90+% drop in demand. How do you predict that? And how do you react to that? Over the years, the supply chain gurus, rightfully so, have been evangelizing about just-in-time manufacturing, keeping just the right amount of inventory, getting it to your customer right when they need it. But the assumptions change. So just-in-time means you might have no product left. So the things that we've relied on, they're being blown up. And I don't think this is a one-shot deal.
Let's end on your final key point here, which is, the last mile, because it's tricky. Is it getting trickier? Is it loosening up? Have we learned anything new and different?
Don't think about first mile, last mile. It's all about how do things get to their end customer. And customers are finding shortages. And that is really tricky because when you start to see it or even anticipate shortages, supply stockouts, then people start to stockpile. Scarcity is one of the most motivating fears. And that creates a big problem because it then perverts consumer behaviors. And when that happens, that puts a lot of downward pressure on your supply chain. So you really have to be mindful of that. And supply chain analysts, as this one gentleman said, Sumant, they are clueless on exact demand right now. It's not a swipe at them. It's just a practical reality.
This is a great panel you facilitated. A lot of great thought ideas coming up. How do you possibly wrap this up for us with some conclusions, recommendations, takeaways? Talk to us.
Kind of last thing first is that right now, supply chain, in terms of your network and suppliers, you need to take this as a harbinger for the future. Map your supply chain, know where your risks are. I do think people are going to start looking at trying to shore up their supply chain more domestically than internationally. Now, it does narrow your choices. It makes things more expensive. That is something that's coming out loud and clear, is people want to be more domestic wherever they are. One other point that I will make, this was a great insight. One of the participants, as I quoted him, is partners will rise or fall together. Really important that they work together well. They're transparent in their communications, and they actually run some of these drills in the future. So there's still a lot of challenges to be faced. There is a lot to learn from, and supply chain experts, really, this is going to be a great lesson for the future because I don't think this will be the last one.
A lot of great knowledge in this panel. We should take a moment to give these 3 experts some extra love. They spent a lot of extra time, provided a lot of additional information. So much stuff to cover today. Where does this leading to? What's coming up in theme number 2, Dan? Can you tell us about that?
Gene, I'm really excited about this next theme. The reason is that in this next theme, we're going to explore what works, what doesn't work, and then lastly, what advice do these experts have for other people across different industries and supply chain. So we're going to get a little bit deeper on the how, and that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think a lot of people looking for solutions will be able to find some of them in the next readout.
Dan, thank you.
My pleasure.
Again, that is Dan Seewald. He's founder and CEO of Deliberate Innovation. He's a keynote speaker, an author, and a corporate innovation expert. He was also head of worldwide innovation at Pfizer. Dan, we'll talk again.
Thanks, Gene.